weeks back, I saw Sri Lankan students getting position at MIT before getting the A-level results. I mean, these are the things that we have to be very progressive, whether A-level is required to do higher education. I mean, if the number one tech university in the world is doing that, why we are waiting for that?
Heminda Jayaweera is Director Planning and Operations at atSLTC Research University, and he's here in the studio today with us to discuss education policy, reforms, and the role of the private sector in higher education. This is Echelon's Reboot Everything Festival. Heminda, to start with, as you see it, what are the challenges confronting university education in Sri Lanka, especially in the context of the economic challenges the country is currently facing?
Yeah, I think it's from the government side, say for the government sector, obviously government expenditure will have to be cut down on various things. So obviously government universities will face that. Then if you look at the students, right, even if you are getting full free sort of education, but still they have to spend on food, accommodation, to travel, to all that. So I think that will affect students really in a big scale, because these are the students like 19 to 22 age group. Parents are not well off in terms of, maybe they are in the latter stage of their working life and things like that. So it's very difficult to fund them on big scale. And these are the students who can't afford while studying going into like full-time work also. So then there's a big issue in terms of when the usual expenses of lodging to all that. So I think that will affect them. And we can see that some of the universities, even the government sector, they had to cut down because of the issues in not the education. Education you can do maybe online or whatever, but the expenses in the canteen to food to all that, and even traveling as well. So I think those are the things that initially you will see. But in addition, you will see there's an effect in long term, like the ranking system, because the ranking system in any ranking model will work on the research, how much of research that you do.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a reduction in the research you do because of people can't get into the universities. You can't do online research, right? Maybe only IT sector can do that. So there's an overall effect on the education system, higher education system, because of the crisis.
What do you think Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan higher education sector can do to improve access, the relevance and standards of university education in the country, you think?
I think one of the things that we have to look at is, obviously the government can't cater the entire higher education system. We have around 500,000 students who is sitting for O-level exams. Maybe half of that's sitting for A-level exams. But if you look at the numbers, only 25,000 positions in the government sector for universities through the A-level, cutoff marks and things like that. So that's about 5% of the entire, that so you take as a batch, that's only what is affordable. Then the rest of the onus comes to maybe other tertiary education, the private sector education. Plus, I know for fact that about 25,000 people go out of Sri Lanka for higher education. That is the government seats that is available.
Sure.
So I think if you look at all these areas, I think more emphasis has to be given to private sector going forward, because it's very profitable industry if you really look at it. If you look at it holistically, not just for locals, but if you can create the situation where we can bring even outsiders, say South Asian students also to Sri Lanka in that context. And also education has changed really dramatically, I think, maybe thanks to even COVID also. We were looking at maybe 20, 30 years ago, it was delivery of knowledge was based on either you go and sit in a lecture hall, the lecturer will tell you whatever that you have to tell and you will write down, or you have to go to the library. But that was the only two way that you can bring the knowledge. Those are the two ways of delivery. But now it has expanded to the next level. Online education is possible. At least it was proven during COVID time. Knowledge is everywhere. You can download anything. So it's very easy in that terms. Obviously, there are costs in the online systems and all that. But then if you look at holistically, education is much easier compared to what it was maybe 20 years ago. Then you have to add the other very important factors in a, say, university, or if you really look at what university is supposed to do, creating new knowledge. So obviously then as research has to happen, Then there is the quality university life has to be given for the students, which is not about just the knowledge in the book, but you have to create someone like a wholesome graduate, for example, sports to other leadership activities, innovation, all this has to happen. So I think that's the area that the university has to really invest in. So I think in that regard, I would say, even with the current context, that's an area that you shouldn't say that we can't invest. Whether it's a government or whether it's a private sector, a country should invest in that area. I think that's the only way. If you look at the whole reasons behind the economic downturn, I think we have been lacking these areas, especially going into innovations, creating students, not just for the particular profession, but a wholesome graduate who can really turn around his knowledge plus his other capabilities towards creating something new. I think those are the areas that we have to continue to invest.
So, in the context of what you are just saying, what you just told me, what do you think the government's priorities should be when it is looking at reforming higher education in Sri Lanka? If it were to address some of these challenges, how do you put that into policy?
Yeah, I think one thing is for private sector higher education, I think there are a lot of policies that need to be, I'm not saying that you need to give everything out. I mean, you have to have certain policies, certain quality and checks by the government, but you have to allow you have to be more flexible in terms of a private sector higher education institute to run. For example, a few weeks back, I saw Sri Lankan students getting a position at MIT before getting the A-level results. So, I mean, here we can't do that. I mean, these are the things that we have to be very progressive, whether A-level is required to do higher education. I mean, if the number one tech university in the world is doing that, why we are waiting for that? I mean, obviously there are certain reasons behind having a method, but then this is like the other extremes that the top universities are doing. Also, most of the top universities in the world, they are not waiting for A-level results. There are bridging programs where they can go from O-levels to then universities. In Sri Lanka, we can't do that. And also, there are some very silly decisions, silly reasons behind. For example, you can't do an engineering degree without doing maybe certain subjects.
Sure.
But obviously there should be a change. So certain subjects you have to do A-level subjects to getting selected to Sri Lankan university, even a private university, to do certain degrees. So I think those are the things that we need to revise. Sure. And also make sure that the private sector universities to build something a little bit more flexible in terms of provision, because at the end of the day, it's Sri Lankan students who are getting benefited. Obviously, they pay a certain amount of money, but then if you don't do that, the same Sri Lankans has to pay a lot more than that to send their kids to foreign universities. So I think that's where the country has to have a different model. Obviously, we know that the government can't give 100% education for 100% students in a one batch. That will never happen.
So in one way, the reforms you're suggesting be done aren't so complicated, but I suppose the secondary school system will have to adapt to be able to make this leap at the end of it.
Exactly. So I think it's already happening. For example, if you look at some of the private schools in Sri Lanka or semi-government schools, they are focusing a lot on getting into even London A-level streams too. I mean, if you look at, say, 3 years ago, the percentage of students who did London A-levels in a, say, semi-government school has now changed. Like, it's so many people are requesting to go do. So in a way, it's a bad for the country, because these kids are now trying to go out of the country. So that's the plan. Early it was maybe 10%. Now it's 20, 30, maybe 50%. So I think the government policy has to be there. So why they go for that extreme selection is because there is no something in between. So either you go for government universities, otherwise you have to go for foreign universities. So I think the policies, even at, as you said, secondary schools or even primary schools, the model has to be in a way that it will support the final destination. Now, for example, A-level results of 2021 still not out. Now we are in the latter stage of 2022. It is August. So those are the things that we should not allow, whatever the economic crisis situation, right? And then we don't know when the 2022 A-levels is due. Nobody knows. So when these things happens, people are now looking at, okay, government education system is not for our kids. Let's forget about it. Let's move on to private sector. So I think that shift is dangerous for a country.
Sure. And if if, for instance, the government cannot meet the demand for higher education by itself, then it needs players such as yourself also to become a key part of providing higher education. And then you need to look at the investment climate, see if this works out for the types of investment required for a private higher education institution. How's that looking? Again, is there potential to improve the investment climate?
I think one sector, I'm talking from the investor point of view, one sector with all the issues that we are facing right now, one sector that is still very profitable or very promising is the education sector. Because if you look at, I mentioned the numbers, was about 25,000 Sri Lankan kids go out of the country every year. That's the number. So they are going to Europe, to Australia, to Singapore, to all these even South Asian destinations for their higher education. And that's obviously rupees going out of the countries, which is we are losing on our end in terms of the balance of payment. We have to spend on dollars. Some are very high numbers. But obviously with the current crisis situation, maybe certain percentage, I would say it's a larger percentage, will not be able to afford that kind of education. Like earlier it was say 180 per dollar, now they have to pay 360, almost double, which was not pre-planned for these parents. So then obviously certain percentage, I would say big percentage will still look at education at least the next couple of years in Sri Lanka. So that's the amount that will turn back to private education. I think so that in that regard, I think it's, if you look at someone who is going to invest in private sector education, that's a big number you are talking about. So it's another maybe 25,000 in the government sector, maybe another 20 to 30,000 in private sector, another 25,000 that goes out of Sri Lanka. Half of that will stay in Sri Lanka for private sector education. So I think that's the big boost for someone who is investing in private sector education. Yes.
Heminda, anything you think you need to add to round this conversation off?
One of the things that, this is more long term. Obviously, we should have done it maybe 10, 20 years ago. I think the education system has to be focused on research, which is something that SLTC has been doing. We want to create the first research university in Sri Lanka for no other reason, because we know that education sector, if you look at all the big rankings that you talk about, Harvard to Oxford to Cambridge, all these universities, they got that status because of the research focus that they have. But in Sri Lanka, we don't have that focus. Even private sector and even in government sector, the focus is more towards graduating, which is also part of university education responsibility. But I think the number one responsibility is the creating knowledge. So I think in that regard, what SLT is trying to do is to create that. Not about only us, but we want to show the way to even other universities also. There's a way, even with all the issues that we see here in Sri Lanka, we still need to focus on that research side, the creating knowledge part in a university, which is the number one responsibility of a university. So that's what we are trying to do, and to show the way to other higher education institutes also how to do it.